The rain hammered against the kitchen window as Margaret wiped down the same counter for the third time that evening. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cold October air seeping through the old farmhouse walls, but from the weight of the secret she had been carrying for 3 months. At 42, she never imagined she would be in this position again. Thomas sat at the worn wooden table, his weathered face buried in his hands. The letter from the bank lay crumpled beside his coffee cup, its contents spelling out their worst fears in cold official language. Foreclosure. 60 days. After 3 generations, the Peterson farm would be lost to creditors and corporate greed. Their son Jake burst through the back door, his college backpack slung over one shoulder and mud caking his work boots. At 19, he carried himself with the confidence of youth, but his eyes held the same worry that had been haunting the household for weeks. He had driven 3 hours from State University the moment he received his father's phone call. Jake slumped into the chair across from his father, running his hands through his dark hair. The resemblance between father and son was striking. The same square jaw, the same determined set to their shoulders, the same stubborn streak that had both saved and cursed the Peterson men for decades. Thomas finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. At 55, the years of farming had carved deep lines around his eyes. But tonight he looked older, defeated. The family had weathered droughts, floods, and market crashes, but this felt different. This felt final. Jake reached into his backpack and pulled out a manila envelope, placing it carefully on the table. His parents stared at it as if it contained a bomb. In many ways, it did. Inside were documents that could save the farm, but at a cost that made Thomas's stomach turn. The Castellano family had made their offer through intermediaries, as they always did. They owned half the county now, their influence spreading like a slow poison through the farming communities. But they needed something the Petersons had. A strategic piece of land that bordered the river, perfect for their newest development project. Their offer was simple and terrible. Jake would work for them for 2 years, helping to facilitate their expansion into agricultural communities. In return, the Petersons would keep their farm and receive enough money to modernize their equipment. It was a devil's bargain, asking Jake to betray everything his family stood for. Margaret finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. She placed a protective hand over her still flat stomach, a gesture that had become unconscious over the past few weeks. The pregnancy had been a shock, coming so late in life and during such uncertain times. She hadn't told them yet about the doctor's latest revelation, that she was carrying triplets. Thomas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the old wooden floor. He grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door and headed toward the barn. Margaret knew he needed space to think, to wrestle with impossible choices in the solitude of the place where 4 generations of Peterson men had found their peace. Jake followed his father outside, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts and fears. Through the window, she watched them standing in the dim light of the barn, their silhouettes animated in heated discussion. She knew Jake was trying to convince his father to let him make the sacrifice. At 19, he still believed he was invincible, that he could handle whatever the Castellanos threw at him. But Margaret had heard the stories. Other young men from farming families had taken similar deals with the Castellanos. Some had disappeared entirely. Others had returned changed, hollow-eyed and broken. The Castellanos didn't just buy land, they bought souls. The phone rang, cutting through the tension like a blade. Margaret hesitated before answering, knowing instinctively that this call would change everything. The voice on the other end was smooth, professional, and utterly without warmth. Vincent Castellano himself was calling, not trusting this delicate negotiation to his usual intermediaries. His message was simple. They had until midnight to decide. After that, the offer would be withdrawn, and the foreclosure would proceed as scheduled. He mentioned, almost casually, that he had heard about Jake's academic achievements, his leadership potential. Young men like Jake were exactly what his organization needed. Margaret's blood ran cold. They had been watching Jake, studying him, planning this moment for months. This wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about recruitment, about pulling promising young people into their web of influence and corruption. She hung up the phone and rushed outside to find Thomas and Jake still deep in conversation. The barn smelled of hay and motor oil, familiar scents that usually brought comfort, but now felt like reminders of everything they stood to lose. Thomas was shaking his head firmly, his voice rising with each word. He had built this farm with his own hands, had poured his life into every acre, but he would not sacrifice his son to save it. There had to be another way, had to be some option they hadn't considered. Jake's face was set in determination, the same stubborn expression Margaret had seen him wear since childhood when he had made up his mind about something. He would not watch his family lose everything while he sat safely in college. The farm wasn't just their livelihood, it was their legacy, their identity. Without it, they were nothing. The argument continued for another hour, voices rising and falling with the rhythm of a familiar dance. Thomas spoke of other farms they could find, other opportunities. Jake countered with the reality of their debt, their age, the impossibility of starting over. Margaret listened to them tear each other apart with love and desperation. Finally, as the clock in the kitchen chimed 11:30, Thomas made a decision that would haunt them all. If someone from the Peterson family had to go, it would be him, not Jake. At 55, he had lived his life, had seen his son grow into a man he was proud of. He would take Jake's place in whatever hell the Castellanos had planned. The silence that followed his declaration was deafening. Jake stared at his father in horror, while Margaret felt the world tilt beneath her feet. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. Fathers weren't supposed to sacrifice themselves for their children's futures. Not like this. But Thomas had already made up his mind. He walked to the house and called Vincent Castellano back, his voice steady and calm as he explained the change in terms. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, then quiet laughter. Castellano agreed, but with conditions of his own. Thomas would leave that very night. There would be no time for goodbyes, no opportunity to change his mind. Margaret watched her husband pack a single bag, moving with the mechanical precision of a man who had already died inside. He kissed her forehead and whispered promises he knew he might not be able to keep. He shook Jake's hand and told him to take care of the farm, to take care of his mother. As the black sedan pulled up their driveway at exactly midnight, Margaret finally found her voice. She told Thomas about the pregnancy, about the triplets she was carrying, about the new lives that would need him in the months to come. His face crumpled for just a moment before he steeled himself again. He climbed into the car without looking back, leaving Margaret and Jake standing in the doorway of a house that no longer felt like home. The taillights disappeared into the night, taking with them the man who had been the foundation of their world. In the days that followed, the money appeared in their accounts as promised. The foreclosure notices stopped coming, but Margaret couldn't bring herself to feel relief. She had traded her husband for financial security, and the weight of that bargain grew heavier with each passing day. Jake threw himself into managing the farm with desperate intensity, as if hard work could somehow undo what had happened. He installed new locks on all the doors and windows, hired a security company, and started carrying his grandfather's old hunting rifle whenever he went out after dark. Margaret's pregnancy became more difficult as the stress took its toll. The doctor warned her about the risks of carrying triplets at her age, especially under such emotional strain, but she refused to consider any alternatives. These children were all she had left of the life she and Thomas had built together. 3 weeks after Thomas disappeared, the first sign appeared that their nightmare was far from over. A package arrived with no return address, containing photographs of Thomas in what looked like a warehouse or factory. He appeared unharmed but changed, his eyes holding a wariness that hadn't been there before. The message tucked inside the package was brief but chilling. Thomas was doing well in his new position, but his family's continued safety depended on their discretion. They were not to contact authorities, not to ask questions, not to interfere with Castellano business in any way. Jake wanted to call the police immediately, but Margaret stopped him. She had heard enough stories about families who had crossed the Castellanos. They had ways of reaching people even in protective custody, even in prison. Their only hope was to keep quiet and pray that Thomas would find a way to come home on his own. But as the weeks turned into months, Margaret began to realize that waiting passively was not an option. The Castellanos had made it clear that one betrayal deserved another. They had taken Thomas not just to secure his services, but to ensure the Peterson family's permanent silence about their operations. Late one night, as she felt the first strong kicks from the babies growing inside her, Margaret made a decision that would put all of their lives at risk. She was going to find her husband and bring him home, no matter what it cost. The Castellanos had underestimated her, had assumed that a pregnant farm wife would be too frightened and helpless to fight back. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. Margaret's transformation began quietly. In the early hours of dawn, when Jake was still sleeping and the house felt like a tomb. At 5 months pregnant with triplets, her body had become unwieldy, but her mind had never been sharper. She started with small things, memorizing license plates of cars that seemed to appear too often on their rural road, noting strangers who lingered too long at the farmer's market, learning the names and faces of everyone who worked for Castellano businesses in the county. The local library became her second home. She researched property records, business licenses, court documents, anything that might give her insight into the Castellano empire. What she discovered made her blood run cold. The family's reach extended far beyond farming. They controlled construction companies, waste management firms, several restaurants, and what appeared to be a complex money laundering operation disguised as agricultural investment. Mrs. Chen, the elderly librarian, had noticed Margaret's intense research sessions and quietly began leaving relevant newspaper clippings on her usual table. Local men who had disappeared, families who had left town suddenly, businesses that had failed under mysterious circumstances, a pattern of fear and control that stretched back decades. Margaret's first real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Rosa Martinez had worked as a cleaning woman for various Castellano businesses for 12 years before her conscience finally got the better of her. She approached Margaret at the grocery store, speaking in hushed tones about the things she had seen and heard while emptying trash bins and cleaning offices. According to Rosa, the Castellanos operated their recruitment program out of an industrial complex 20 miles east of town. The men they recruited weren't just workers. They were being trained for something much more dangerous. Rosa had seen weapons, surveillance equipment, and detailed maps of farms and businesses throughout the region. Whatever Thomas had been pulled into, it wasn't agricultural consulting. Margaret began making regular trips to the industrial complex, parking her beaten pickup truck behind an abandoned gas station with a clear view of the facility. She watched shifts change, noted which vehicles came and went, and slowly began to identify the patterns of movement around the building. On her third surveillance trip, she saw him. Thomas looked thinner than she remembered, his hair grayer, but it was definitely him. He emerged from the main building, flanked by 2 men in dark suits, climbed into a van, and disappeared down the highway heading south. Margaret's hands shook as she started her truck and followed at a distance, her heart pounding so hard she was afraid it would disturb the babies. The van led her through a maze of back roads to a sprawling estate hidden behind high walls and electronic gates. Margaret parked a quarter-mile away and used binoculars Jake had given her for bird watching to study the property. It was a fortress, guard towers, security cameras, patrol dogs. Getting Thomas out of there would require more than just courage. It would require a miracle. That night, Margaret called her sister Linda in Chicago. Linda had married a police detective and had always been the practical one in the family. When Margaret explained the situation, Linda's response was immediate and terrifying. The Castellanos were connected to organized crime families in 3 states. Local law enforcement was either corrupted or terrified. The FBI had been investigating them for years without success. Linda begged Margaret to take Jake and leave town immediately. The pregnancy made her vulnerable, and the Castellanos had a reputation for eliminating threats without hesitation. But Margaret couldn't abandon Thomas. Couldn't let the man who had sacrificed everything for their family die alone in whatever hell they had created for him. Instead, she began preparing for war. She withdrew their savings in cash, bought supplies that couldn't be traced back to her, and started learning skills she never imagined she would need. YouTube videos taught her about surveillance, self-defense, and basic explosives. The local gun shop owner, a friend of Thomas's, quietly sold her ammunition and taught her to shoot with deadly accuracy. Margaret's belly grew larger each week, making her movements more difficult, but also providing perfect camouflage. Who would suspect a heavily pregnant woman of planning a rescue operation? She used her condition to gain access to places and information that would have been impossible otherwise. The breakthrough came when she overheard a conversation at the medical clinic during her routine prenatal appointment. Dr. Williams was treating several men from the Castellano operation for what he described as industrial injuries. But Margaret heard enough details to know they were treating gunshot wounds and other trauma consistent with violence. More importantly, she learned that medical supplies were being delivered to the estate twice a week. A local medical supply company had the contract, and their driver, Pete Kowalski, was drowning in gambling debts. Margaret approached him carefully, offering to pay off his debts in exchange for information about the estate's layout and security procedures. Pete was terrified, but desperation made him willing to listen. He drew detailed maps of the estate, including the locations of the guard posts, the main residence, and the barracks where the recruited men were housed. According to Pete, Thomas was being kept in a separate building along with several other men who seemed to be receiving special treatment or special punishment. Margaret's plan began to take shape. She couldn't rely on brute force or professional skills she didn't possess. Instead, she would use the one advantage she had, the element of complete surprise. No one would expect a pregnant woman to mount a rescue operation. Their underestimation would be their downfall. She began gathering equipment and allies. Jake wanted to help, but Margaret refused to put him at risk. Instead, she recruited Rosa Martinez, whose years of cleaning for the Castellanos had given her intimate knowledge of their routines and weaknesses. Rosa's grandson, Miguel, a veteran of the war in Afghanistan, provided technical expertise in exchange for money to help his grandmother escape the county safely. The plan was simple, but dangerous. During the next medical supply delivery, Margaret would hide in Pete's truck and gain access to the estate. Rosa would create a distraction by accidentally triggering the fire alarm system she had memorized during her years of cleaning. In the resulting confusion, Margaret would locate Thomas and get him to a predetermined escape route where Miguel would be waiting with transportation. Everything that could go wrong with the plan seemed catastrophically obvious to Margaret, but she was out of time and options. Her pregnancy was becoming more difficult, and the doctor had warned her that the stress was putting both her and the babies at risk. If she was going to act, it had to be soon. 3 days before the planned rescue, everything went sideways. Pete Kowalski was found dead in his apartment, apparently from a drug overdose, though Margaret knew he had been clean for 2 years. Someone had discovered their connection, which meant the Castellanos knew she was planning something. Margaret's phone rang at 2 in the morning. The voice was Vincent Castellano himself, speaking with the calm assurance of a man who held all the cards. He knew about her surveillance, her research, her recruitment of allies. He knew about Rosa and Miguel. He even knew about her pregnancy with triplets. The message was clear. Any attempt to rescue Thomas would result in the deaths of everyone involved, including the unborn children. Thomas was valuable to them, but not irreplaceable. Margaret and her family, however, had become a liability that needed to be eliminated. Castellano gave her 24 hours to take Jake and leave the county permanently. They could keep the farm and the money, but they would never see Thomas again, and they would never speak about what they knew. Any deviation from this arrangement would have fatal consequences. Margaret hung up the phone and sat in her dark kitchen, feeling the babies moving restlessly inside her. She had two choices: accept exile and save her children, or fight back and risk everything. The weight of the decision seemed impossible to bear. Jake found her there at dawn, still sitting at the table with tears streaming down her face. When she told him about Castellano's ultimatum, his reaction was immediate and fierce. They would not run. They would not abandon his father. If the Castellanos wanted a war, they would get one. But Margaret knew they were outmatched and outgunned. The only weapon they had left was desperation and the willingness to sacrifice everything for the slim chance of rescuing Thomas. As she felt another strong kick from one of the babies, she realized that her children's future depended on decisions she made in the next few hours. That evening, Margaret made a choice that surprised even herself. Instead of running or mounting a hopeless rescue attempt, she decided to turn the tables on the Castellanos. She called Vincent back with a proposal that left him speechless. She offered to trade herself for Thomas. A pregnant woman carrying triplets was worth more to them than a 55-year-old farmer. They could use her as leverage against dozens of other families. A perpetual hostage whose condition would prevent any rescue attempts. In return, Thomas would go free, and Jake would be allowed to keep the farm. Castellano was intrigued despite himself. Margaret Peterson had shown more courage and intelligence than he had expected. Having her under his control would indeed provide significant advantages. After a long pause, he agreed to consider the proposal, but with conditions of his own that would make Margaret's sacrifice even more terrible than she had imagined. Vincent Castellano's conditions were more twisted than Margaret had anticipated. He didn't just want her as a hostage, he wanted to break her spirit completely. The exchange would happen, but not immediately. Margaret would have to spend the remaining months of her pregnancy under their surveillance, proving her compliance before they would consider releasing Thomas. Any sign of defiance, any attempt to contact authorities, and both she and Thomas would disappear permanently. Margaret agreed, but she was already planning her next move. She had learned enough about the Castellano operation to know their greatest weakness: their arrogance. They believed they had won, that a pregnant woman posed no real threat to their empire. That assumption would be their downfall. The surveillance began immediately. Black cars appeared on the roads around the farm, and strangers started showing up in town asking questions about the Peterson family. Margaret played her part perfectly, acting defeated and resigned while secretly documenting everything she observed about her watchers' routines and methods. Jake was furious about the arrangement, but Margaret convinced him it was their only chance to save his father. She gave him instructions that seemed like the desperate wishes of a frightened woman, but were actually carefully crafted elements of her real plan. He was to contact her sister Linda in Chicago and ask for help finding a good lawyer. He was to gather all the financial records related to their dealings with the Castellanos. Most importantly, he was to start recording everything: conversations, photographs, license plates, anything that might serve as evidence. What Jake didn't know was that Margaret had already been in contact with Linda, and through her, with FBI agents who had been investigating the Castellanos for years. The federal agents were skeptical at first. Civilian informants rarely survived long enough to provide useful intelligence. But Margaret's detailed observations and Rosa Martinez's inside knowledge had given them leads they had been pursuing unsuccessfully for months. Special Agent Sarah Chen had been working the Castellano case for 3 years without a breakthrough. When Linda contacted her about Margaret's situation, she saw an opportunity that was both promising and terrifying. Margaret was in the perfect position to gather intelligence from inside the organization, but the risks were enormous. A pregnant woman attempting to infiltrate a criminal organization was almost certain to end in tragedy. Margaret met with Agent Chen at a truck stop halfway between the farm and the city, using the cover of a routine prenatal appointment. The agent was younger than Margaret had expected, with the kind of intense focus that came from years of dealing with violent criminals. She explained that the FBI had been building a case against the Castellanos for racketeering, money laundering, and human trafficking, but they needed evidence that would hold up in court. The plan they developed was more complex than Margaret's original rescue attempt, but it offered a real chance of destroying the entire Castellano empire rather than just saving Thomas. Margaret would allow herself to be taken into custody by the Castellanos as planned, but she would be wearing sophisticated recording equipment disguised as medical monitoring devices for her pregnancy. Everything she saw and heard would be transmitted to federal agents who would be positioned around the estate. The technical challenges were significant. The recording equipment had to be small enough to avoid detection, but powerful enough to transmit through the estate security systems. It had to be disguised as medical equipment that would be believable for a high-risk pregnancy. Most importantly, it had to function reliably under the stress of whatever the Castellanos put Margaret through. Agent Chen's team worked around the clock to develop the equipment, testing it repeatedly under various conditions. The final device was a work of art, a combination heart monitor and fetal monitoring system that looked completely authentic, but transmitted everything to a receiver hidden in a medical supply truck that would be parked permanently outside the estate. While the technical preparations were underway, Margaret continued her surveillance of the Castellano operation, now with federal backing and resources. What they discovered was far worse than anyone had imagined. The organization wasn't just involved in local crime. They were part of an international network that specialized in forcing skilled workers into indentured servitude. The men recruited from farming communities weren't just being trained as enforcers. They were being prepared for overseas assignments, where their agricultural expertise would be used to establish drug production operations. Thomas and the others weren't prisoners. They were being transformed into unwilling participants in a global criminal enterprise. This revelation changed everything. The FBI operation expanded to include agents from multiple agencies and several foreign countries. Margaret's mission became not just about rescuing Thomas, but about bringing down a network that had destroyed hundreds of families across multiple continents. The strain of maintaining her cover while preparing for the operation was taking its toll on Margaret's pregnancy. She was hospitalized twice for complications related to carrying triplets under extreme stress. Each time she had to convince Jake and the Castellano watchers that she was simply suffering from normal pregnancy complications, while secretly meeting with Agent Chen and receiving updates on the investigation. Dr. Williams, Margaret's obstetrician, had been quietly brought into the operation after Agent Chen verified his security clearance from his military service. He helped modify the monitoring equipment to make it medically accurate and provided Margaret with drugs that would help her stay alert and focused during the most dangerous phases of the mission. The exchange was scheduled for Margaret's 8th month of pregnancy, when she would be too vulnerable to pose any physical threat, but still capable of providing intelligence. Vincent Castellano had become personally involved in planning her captivity, seeing her as a prize that would demonstrate his organization's reach and power. 3 days before the planned exchange, Margaret received devastating news. Rosa Martinez had been found dead in her apartment, apparently from a heart attack, though Agent Chen suspected poisoning. Miguel had disappeared, and Pete Kowalski's replacement as the medical supply driver had also vanished. The Castellanos were eliminating anyone who might have information about the FBI operation. Agent Chen wanted to abort the mission immediately, but Margaret refused. They were too close to bringing down the entire network, and she knew this might be their only chance. Thomas had been moved to the overseas facility, and according to their intelligence, he would be shipped out of the country within days. If they didn't act now, she might never see him again. The night of the exchange arrived with a thunderstorm that seemed to mirror the chaos in Margaret's heart. She kissed Jake goodbye, knowing she might never see him again, and climbed into the black sedan that would take her to the estate. The recording equipment felt heavy against her chest, but it was also comforting, proof that she wasn't going into this completely alone. The estate was even more intimidating at night, with spotlights cutting through the rain and armed guards patrolling the grounds. Margaret was taken to a suite of rooms that had been prepared specifically for her, complete with medical equipment and a nursery for the babies she was expected to deliver in captivity. Vincent Castellano met her personally, his smooth demeanor barely concealing the violence that lurked beneath the surface. He explained her role in his organization with the casual confidence of a man who had never been challenged. She would be a symbol of his power, a demonstration that even the most independent people could be broken and controlled. Her children would be raised as part of his extended family, loyal to him above all others. What Castellano didn't know was that every word he spoke was being recorded and transmitted to federal agents who were moving into position around the estate. Margaret's pregnancy had given her access to the heart of the organization in a way that years of investigation had failed to achieve. Over the next week, Margaret gathered intelligence that exceeded the FBI's wildest expectations. She met the other captives, recorded conversations between Castellano and his lieutenants, and documented financial transactions that proved the scope of their international operations. The evidence she collected would be enough to bring down not just the Castellano family, but their partners in 6 other countries. But the stress of her double life was pushing her body to its limits. The babies were coming early, and Margaret knew she was running out of time. Agent Chen had promised that federal agents would move in to arrest the Castellanos as soon as Margaret gave birth, but complications with her labor meant the raid would have to happen under the most dangerous possible circumstances. Margaret went into labor on a rainy Tuesday morning, 3 weeks earlier than expected. As she was rushed to the medical facility on the estate, she transmitted a final message to Agent Chen, a code phrase that meant the operation should begin immediately, regardless of the risks. What followed was 12 hours of the most intense drama any of the participants would ever experience. While Margaret fought to bring 3 new lives into the world, federal agents surrounded the estate and began the largest organized crime raid in the region's history. The Castellanos, caught completely off guard, found themselves facing charges that would put them away for life. Thomas was rescued from the overseas facility in a coordinated international operation that freed 47 other captives. He was flown back to the United States and arrived at the hospital just as Margaret was delivering their 3rd child, a moment of pure joy that seemed impossible after everything they had endured. The trials that followed made national news, with Margaret's recorded evidence serving as the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Vincent Castellano and 12 of his associates received life sentences, while their international partners were arrested in coordinated raids across 3 continents. Jake took over management of the farm with a maturity that impressed everyone who knew him. He used the federal government's reward money to modernize their equipment and expand their operations, turning the Peterson farm into one of the most successful in the county. More importantly, he established a foundation to help other farming families who had been targeted by organized crime, ensuring that the Peterson family's ordeal would help protect others from similar threats. Margaret and Thomas named their triplets Hope, Faith, and Justice. names that reflected both their gratitude for surviving and their determination to make something positive come from their suffering. The children grew up knowing the story of their parents' courage, understanding that freedom and safety were not guaranteed, but had to be fought for and protected. Years later, when Margaret looked back on those terrible months, she realized that the most important lesson had nothing to do with crime or punishment. It was about the power of love to drive people to extraordinary actions, the strength that comes from protecting family, and the surprising courage that can emerge when ordinary people are pushed to their limits. The Peterson farm still stands today, prosperous and peaceful, surrounded by fields that Thomas and Margaret tend together every morning. Their children are grown now, each pursuing their own dreams but carrying with them the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victories come from the willingness to sacrifice everything for the people you love. The nightmares have faded, replaced by the simple pleasures of a life earned through courage and sustained by the unbreakable bonds of family. In the end, Thomas's decision to take his son's place that terrible night had led not just to his own salvation, but to the destruction of an empire built on fear and the creation of something much more powerful, a legacy of hope that would protect families for generations to come.